So hello, ladies and gentlemen. We have together with us today a very special guest from the Atlantic Council. It's Mr. Jörn Fleck, Senior Director of the Europe Center and Transform Europe Initiative within the Atlantic Council. Mr. Fleck, thank you for being together with us here in the Bucharest office of the Atlantic Council, and thank you for this interview.
Thank you for having me.
You have a wide range of experience, born in Germany, focused on transatlantic relations. You are focused on the relations between EU and the United States, also on trade, Brexit. You work within the transatlantic arena when Great Britain was still in the European Union, and now we see this major reshuffle in our transatlantic bond, and we see countries that are trying to keep the ranks together and preserve this relation. And we have to say in the beginning of our interview that this week you have a duplex, a joint, let's say, venture with Atlantic Council's Central Europe Week in Warsaw and in Bucharest. And I would like to start with that. So zooming out with this role of the Atlantic Council in trying to make Central Europe and Eastern Europe to be more vocal on the transatlantic arena and in the debate. What is the idea behind Central Europe Week, and how does this initiative seek to reposition the region from a policy recipient to a strategic agenda setter, both in Washington and in Brussels?
Well, thank you for highlighting Central Europe Week. That's a week-long series of programming. Actually, this year we're starting in Bucharest, we're going to Warsaw, and we'll end up in Prague with discussions around some of the key issues impacting Central Europe, Europe, and the transatlantic partnership. And that this program is very much focused on the region's role on security and defense for Europe, on the economic vibrancy and resilience of the region, but also Europe writ large, and the political leadership that really the region has brought to many of these issues. This region was first to see the Russian threat for what it really is and has been before many others in Europe. This region has acted upon that before everyone else. This region has also been a key driver of European economic dynamism, of technology leadership and innovation in many areas. And so we really want to highlight those experiences and what they can contribute to a more forward-leaning Europe and a rebalanced transatlantic partnership.
You put a lot of layers in our discussion, both security and defense, also economy. I would say that this field has a buzzword in the European Union. It's competitiveness now, and we have a lot of debate on that, including in relation with Washington. But given the recent moments at the transatlantic level, from Greenland to Davos, have these moments have exposed frictions and tensions within the alignment that we were supposed to see in Europe's US relations. How do you read the current state of the transatlantic partnership under these umbrellas, and how influential is Central Europe's collective voice in shaping debates in Washington today?
That's a lot of questions in one.
I know.
Let me try and take them. So number one, of course, we've seen significant disruption in the first 12 months of the Trump 2 administration in the relationship with Europe, in the overall global engagement and posture of the United States. I personally don't think that should have surprised anyone.
No.
President Trump very clearly signaled that on the campaign trail and coming into office. And it's been also not a Trump administration specific set of issues. We've heard about reprioritization, and we've heard about the need for Europe to step up and to rebalance within the NATO alliance for a long time from Democratic and Republican administrations. But the Trump 2 administration has been the first to really push through and follow through on these demands and policy shifts. And I think Europe overall has adapted and managed this much more effectively than maybe Europe gives itself credit for. on NATO and 5% defense spending, on where we are today, on how the United States, Ukraine, and Europe are approaching negotiations for a settlement of Russia's continued war, and where Europe is going on its competitiveness agenda and trade diversification and other economic issues. Again, could Europe be doing even better, be more ambitious, even more ambitious, and even more effective? For sure, but I think we have trend lines that are pointing in the
Don't
right.
talk the talk and walk the talk.
Walk the walk, you know, and we need to see more ambition there. We can discuss that in more detail. But overall, I think it's important for Europe to take the long view, also for the United States to take the long view on this relationship. I think we should not underestimate, for all the rebalancing that's needed, for all the changes in the relationship that we've known for a long time they've had to happen, and they're beginning to happen now, that ultimately in this relationship we have a unique strategic asset, both for the United States and for Europe, and none of our strategic competitors have that kind of asset in such a deep and wide relationship.
But do you feel that deep down, both Washington and European capitals understand this profound link? Because when we see it at the surface of the political debate, political discourse, we see the tendency to break apart.
Look, I think some parts of the shock therapy from the United States, from this administration, is maybe overshooting, right? It's encouraging the worst actors, elements, and reflexes on both sides. That, I think, needs to be recalibrated, needs to be adjusted for. At the same time, I think Europe has understood that it needs to take a much greater share of the burden and responsibility, really, for its own security. And that's fundamentally a good thing. I think that will also contribute to a healthier relationship over the medium to long term. And I think we need to step a little bit back from the immediate emotions and focus on what we've already achieved and what we need to achieve from a European and a transatlantic perspective. And you know, none of this is pretty or easy, and the tensions are real and the emotions are real. That's because we've come to expect a lot more from each other. But that's okay. When it comes to the role of Central Europe that you asked about, I do think, I mean, it's even made explicit in the national security strategy that
that's my
Central
next point,
Europe,
so please go.
Yeah, that Central Europe, you know, is on a good way and is, you know, that this administration recognizes the role that Central Europe and different countries in that region have played on the security front, on the economic front, and so I think that's all positive. But again, these countries, and because of the administration's focus on implementation and follow through, need to also keep it up.
But this type of approach we already had in the Trump 1.0. We know that he met at the NATO London summit with the 2%ers back then, the countries that were spending at least 2% of GDP on defense, which were the countries on the eastern flank. And we also know the involvement that the US administration within the first Trump tenure had within the 3 Cs initiative, for instance. But the reason I asked you about how do you see Central Europe having a collective voice is because when we look on with the lenses of the national security strategy that you invoked, the United States wants to reconnect better with countries that try, let's say, to challenge the current Brussels leadership. You're considering that and looking at the specific of our region. Do you see this as a momentum of Central Europe having a collective voice, or playing, let's say, individual voices because of this approach?
Look, I think there's some important similarities and shared challenges that this very diverse region has, and then there's obviously individual perspectives and dynamics in the relationship and the national outlook between, if you take the 3 Cs countries as a sample, right, between the Baltics and on the one hand and Poland and Czech Republic and for example, Romania on the southeastern end of that, of that range, geographical range. So there's important differences. There's also some important similarities, and that's where I think the region as a whole can try and work on some of the priorities that are very much aligned with the administration's America First approach, as they say, not America alone. And that's on the energy and infrastructure front, that's on the security and defense front, where there's important opportunities and where priorities of the administration for Europe writ large, for example, on the energy and infrastructure a set of issues does align, and their 3 Cs can be, I think we need to slightly reinvent the 3 Cs initiative. We can come to that. Mm-hmm. I think whenever the United States tries to insert sort of ideological or partisan elements into its relations with individual countries, not just in Europe, I think leaderships need to keep in mind all countries have a relationship with the United States and not just one administration. And so what these countries do at the EU level, I think we just have very different perspectives there from different member states. And that's, that has to be negotiated through the European policy element and approach of these countries. You need to do that for your own country, not for this or that US administration, in all honesty.
Since you brought the discussion how a country should follow its national interest in this way, and we also see the new Romanian security and defense strategy that was released last year with this independence in solidarity concept within the strategy. I would like to bring the focus to Romania on this, and we know that our country has often been cited as a frontline state, let's say an island of stability, and also with a growing strategic relevance. But now, how do you see Romania with the new administration, both in Washington and both in Bucharest, more effectively projecting and playing its interests and expertise in Washington and in Brussels and in between them?
So one, to your last point, I've always looked at Romania for its unique role of sort of being fully in on the transatlantic dimension and fully in on the European Union dimension of its foreign policy, and I think that's been a very smart approach. And
it is a smart approach, and sorry to interrupt you, because we have a debate here in Romania right now that are calling for a more, let's say, revolutionary approach to maybe choose sides or maybe go with one side more than the other.
Again, I think Romania has stood out in recent years and decades, really, and certainly since it's joining NATO and joining the European Union, for really pursuing a strong commitment to both of these tracks, and they are continuing to be complementary, I believe, and I think taking the long view on these relationships, and NATO alliance considerations, security and defense considerations, economic and even now defense industrial considerations, like Romania's share of the SAFE instrument. Pursuing that very much, that strong commitment to both tracks, I think is, in the long view, the smart thing, continues to be the smart thing to do. I think it's obvious to many outside of Romania that Romania has really stepped up. It has played a key role at the EU level, but also at the national level in terms of support for Ukraine and keeping Ukraine in the fight, and what Romania has done as a neighbor and a uniquely positioned neighbor in that, especially when you look at certain ports and the Danube infrastructure and what it has allowed Ukraine to do, what Romania can do on Black Sea security. These are all huge opportunities for Romania to step up. There's been so much attention on Poland. I think that's a huge success story. But what Poland has done on the northeastern end of Central Europe and the NATO front, eastern front, flank, I should say, sorry.
Some would prefer front.
Some would prefer front, and it's not entirely inadequate or inaccurate for this, given Russian hybrid challenges and more. But what Poland has done on the northeastern flank or front, I think Romania is rapidly leaning into a role that it could replicate on the southeastern end of that flank, and that will give Romania a lot more influence and reach in Washington, D.C. as well, despite whatever political challenges there are.
Although this good line would have been great to finish our interview, I still have two questions.
Great.
On technology and on security and defense. And I would firstly focus on technology, but from a broader view, a transatlantic view. How do you see issues such as digital platforms, technological sovereignty, and artificial intelligence factor into today's transatlantic tensions? And how can we turn this, let's say, in areas or engines to closer cooperation than competition if we look at the global scale?
Yeah, I think, look, obviously technology issues and especially artificial intelligence are part and parcel of national security and geopolitics. That's very much the prism through which this U.S. administration is looking at these issues. If you see all of the efforts on the technology, on the trade and export control front, on the relationship with China, and even its energy policy front. And so I think Europe needs to really prioritize these issues as part and parcel and an integral part of its own strategy to put more weight and political heft and economic heft behind its geopolitical role. I think in Europe we're still thinking of these maybe a little bit too narrowly as sort of an economic issue, right? Or merely technology issues. I think there's been a change over the last 5+ years in how Europe approaches the issues, but it's not been nearly as ambitious and far-reaching enough. At the same time, I think this idea of absolute European sovereignty or strategic autonomy, let's focus on what Europe can achieve together with its allies, and I still believe in the long term the United States and Europe have shaped a unique economic relationship, and the technology part of that and the innovation part and investment part of all of this is still so deeply integrated between the two sides. That's a strength for the United States and for Europe when we see new challenges from China, for example, on critical sectors, on critical raw materials, on critical technologies. So I think Europe needs to take an even more ambitious and comprehensive view of the role of technology in its geopolitical considerations. And I think trying to replicate something at home that, it will require, Europe needs certain safeguards and certain greater security of supply on certain technologies and critical raw materials. I think sort of this imaginary, the goal of autonomy, I think is very far-fetched for an economy that's very export-oriented, like the European Union.
And on security and defense, we know that this is a line of mutual cooperation between both aisles of the North Atlantic. But now with the US calling for more conventional responsibility, not unconventional, not nuclear umbrella responsibilities, what do you think should be the next steps, both in EU-US relations, but also when it comes to countries here in Central Europe, and how can this cooperation be further developed?
So I think it's an important distinction you made. You know, this administration has made it explicit, and I think it's intentional, that Europe ought to step up on it taking primary responsibility for its own conventional defense and deterrence. And I think we're seeing important countries across Europe trending in that direction and taking important steps. I think Europe writ large needs to figure out how best to address this sort of fragmentation in its defense industrial markets, a still not fully integrated defense market internally. It needs to rapidly address the what lessons there are to be learned from, for example, Ukraine, to factor that in and build that into how it uses this increased defense spending, especially these up to 800 billion euros under SAFE and rearm or readiness 2030 now, and really make the most of those lessons in terms of technology, innovation, how to build that into a new enhanced defense industrial base. That's I think some critical questions. We're actually doing a lot of work at the Europe Center and at the Atlantic Council through our Reimagining European Defense and Innovation Task Force, if people want to look that up. But that's, I think, a key question. And then how, as with the technology question, how do you make the most of synergies? Neither of our defense industrial bases on either side of the Atlantic can handle and address the needs that we have after decades of underinvestment alone. So how do we make the most? How do we build up a European defense industrial base? How do we ensure we get the most out of our American allies still?
Thank God we still have NATO.
And, you know, and I think preserving and building out and updating and upgrading NATO as much as possible from the European side. You know, rather than sort of assuming there are fundamental
NATO
challenges.
3.0, as President Stubb of Finland said, or it's too much?
Look, I'm a big fan, as on the EU side of things, you know, where you have this discussion of two-speed or multi-speed or core Europe and all these.
It has resurfaced.
It has resurfaced.
From Berlin, actually.
From Berlin. I'm personally not a big fan of it. I think there are important debates to be had. And even on these issues, I'm a big fan of, and that's how I believe Europe has actually been built over the last, you know, whatever, 8 decades, and also especially since the Big Bang expansion. It's been less about these theoretical concepts and much more about practical cooperation that has been built around countries willing to move ahead and then expanding. I mean, even Schengen came out of a much smaller set of countries that has expanded. Well. The Euro, the origins of defense and security cooperation in Europe, police and judicial cooperation. I mean, it's always, in many cases, I shouldn't say always, in many cases, that's been the way forward. And I think we should learn from that a little bit, and not so much worry about theoretical or treaty concepts, and rather find practical cooperation that has real outputs for the challenges that Europe faces, that the transatlantic partnership faces, and figure out how we get effective responses to those. And then you can build that out, you can institutionalize that, you can codify it in treaties and reforms and so on and so forth.
I still have just a short follow-up. What would be better for transatlantic relations, a whole and united Europe or a multi-speed Europe? Because I have to ask, given the conversation that we had.
For the United States or for the transatlantic relationship?
Go with both.
Look, whatever short-term gains that any one administration or political actor in the United States thinks it can get out of a more divided Europe, I think that's a very short-sighted view of things. Ultimately, even if Europe is a more weighty actor and will be more demanding once it has really truly stepped up on security and defense, as we've already seen on the economy, I think that will still be a much more capable and useful partner and a real strategic asset for the United States than a divided, Europe. A united Europe in the long term is better for the United States. It's also better for Europe.
Thank you very much for this interview, Mr. Jörn Fleck, Senior Director of Europe Center Transform Europe Initiative within the Atlantic Council. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. I have to close this up.